The jungle breathes in the pre-dawn darkness. Moisture hangs thick between the trees, clinging to leaves, to skin, to steel. Along a ridgeline overlooking the Matanako River, 400 Japanese soldiers crouch in silence. Their Type 38 rifles rest against their shoulders, long, elegant weapons that have served the emperor faithfully through Manchuria, through China, through the early sweeps across the Pacific. The battalion commander, Captain Tadashi Suzuki, checks his watch. In 12 minutes they will surge forward. The Americans below number perhaps 150. The mathematics are simple. Suzuki has read the intelligence reports. The enemy carries a new rifle, semi-automatic they say. Some kind of automatic weapon for common infantry. He has seen photographs. The M1 Garand. It looks heavy, crude. American machinery. No craftsmanship. No soul. His officers laughed when they saw it. Toys, one had said. They give toys to boys who cannot aim. The signal comes. 400 men rise as one organism and begin their descent. The jungle swallows the sound of their movement. 60 meters. 40. 30. Then the dawn cracks open. The sound is unlike anything Suzuki has ever heard. Not the individual crack 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 of rifle fire. Not the rhythmic bursts of machine guns. This is something else. A continuous roar. A wall of sound that doesn't pause, doesn't hesitate, doesn't stop to breathe. His men are falling before they understand they're being hit. Suzuki drops behind a fallen log and realizes, with a cold precision that cuts through the chaos, that they are not advancing at all. They are pinned. Completely. By toys. The Pacific War did not begin with the M1 Garand. It began with empire and ambition, with Japan's expansion across Asia and America's slow awakening to the cost of isolationism. When Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, they shattered not just battleships but illusions. The United States entered the war with industrial might and geographic advantage, but its ground forces carried equipment that belonged in many ways to another era. The standard American infantry rifle in 1941 was the M1903 Springfield. It was a bolt-action weapon, a rifle that required a soldier to manually cycle a bolt handle after each shot, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a new one. This took time. Precious fractions of seconds that, in combat, measured the distance between life and death. The Springfield was accurate, reliable, beloved by those who carried it. But it was also slow. A well-trained soldier could fire perhaps 15 aimed shots per minute. Maybe 20 in desperation. The Japanese carried similar weapons. Their Type 38 and Type 99 Arisaka rifles were also bolt-action designs, though lighter and longer than the Springfield. Japanese military doctrine emphasized marksmanship. Soldiers trained to fire from distance to make each shot count. The rifle was an extension of discipline, of Bushido, of the warrior's precision. Volume of fire was less important than accuracy. Why waste bullets when one properly placed would suffice? This philosophy had served Japan well in previous conflicts. In the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, Japanese infantry had stunned the world with their discipline and marksmanship. In China from 1937 onward, their soldiers overwhelmed opponents with tactical skill and willingness to endure hardship. But the wars in Asia had been fought, largely, against forces equipped similarly or worse. Bolt-action rifles against bolt-action rifles. The battlefield was relatively balanced in terms of individual firepower. The M1 Garand changed that equation entirely. Its story begins not on a battlefield but in a workshop. John Cantius Garand was born in Quebec in 1888, the eldest of 12 children. His family moved to Connecticut when he was 11, and young John found work in a textile mill. But his mind bent naturally toward mechanics, toward understanding how things worked and how they might work better. He taught himself engineering through observation and experimentation. By his 20s he was designing machinery. By his 30s he was designing weapons. In 1919, the U.S. Army began searching for a new service rifle. World War I had demonstrated the value of semi-automatic fire, one trigger pull, one shot, with the weapon automatically ejecting the spent casing and loading the next round. Several designers submitted prototypes. Garand was among them. His early designs failed. But he persisted, refining, testing, breaking and rebuilding. The Army gave him a position at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. For 16 years he worked. The rifle that finally emerged in 1936 was revolutionary. The M1 Garand was a gas-operated, semi-automatic rifle chambered in .30-06 Springfield, the same powerful cartridge as the bolt-action rifles it would replace. It weighed 9.5 pounds. It fed from an en bloc clip that held 8 rounds. When the last round was fired, the clip ejected with a distinctive metallic ping, and the soldier could immediately reload. No bolt to cycle. No manual operation between shots. Just aim, squeeze, 8 times without pause. The U.S. military adopted it officially in 1936, but production ramped slowly. By Pearl Harbor, only a fraction of American infantry carried the Garand. Many units still relied on the Springfield. But as 1942 progressed and American industry shifted to total war production, the M1 began flowing to units across the world. To North Africa, to Europe, and to the Pacific. Japanese intelligence noted the new weapon. Reports filtered back from early engagements. But understanding a weapon on paper and facing it in jungle combat are different things entirely. The prevailing attitude among Japanese officers was dismissive. Semi-automatic fire meant less accuracy, they reasoned. It meant soldiers who sprayed bullets instead of aiming properly. It meant industrial shortcuts, American obsession with quantity over quality. They cannot match our discipline, one training manual suggested. They rely on machinery because they lack spirit. This was not mere propaganda. It reflected a genuine cultural difference in military philosophy. Japanese soldiers underwent rigorous training that emphasized physical hardship, mental discipline, and loyalty unto death. Their rifles were crafted with care, each part fitted by skilled hands. The weapon was an heirloom, a sacred tool. American production, by contrast, seemed almost profane in its scale. Factories stamping out thousands of rifles per week. Interchangeable parts. Assembly lines. No soul, no honor, just machinery. What Japanese intelligence failed to grasp was that the M1 Garand represented something more profound than a faster rifle. It represented a fundamental shift in how warfare itself was conceived. The American military doctrine that emerged in the 1930s did not romanticize individual marksmanship the way Japanese or European armies often did. This was not because American soldiers were less skilled, but because American military theorists were grappling with the lessons of World War I from a different angle. They had seen what machine guns could do. They had seen how concentrated firepower could dominate terrain, suppress enemy movement, and create opportunities for maneuver. The question became, how do you give that kind of suppressive capability to every rifleman? The M1 Garand was the answer. With a semi-automatic rifle, an 8-man rifle squad could deliver the firepower of a much larger bolt-action unit. The math was simple but devastating. A soldier with a bolt-action rifle firing 15 rounds per minute was now matched against a soldier with an M1 firing 40 to 60 rounds per minute, and doing so with comparable accuracy at combat ranges. Multiply that across a platoon, a company, a battalion, and the disparity became overwhelming. But firepower alone was not the whole story. The psychological impact was equally significant, though harder to measure. American soldiers trained with the M1 Garand developed a different relationship with their weapon than previous generations had with the Springfield. The Garand was faster, yes, but it was also more forgiving. A soldier who missed his first shot could immediately fire a second, a third, a fourth, without breaking his sight picture, without taking his eye from the target, without the manual cycling that broke rhythm and focus. This changed how soldiers thought about combat. Confidence increased. The weapon felt less like a precision instrument that demanded perfection and more like a tool that allowed aggression. Fire and maneuver became more fluid. Suppression became easier. And in the close-quarters chaos of jungle or island combat, where engagements happened at ranges measured in dozens of meters rather than hundreds, the ability to put multiple rounds downrange quickly was the difference between winning a firefight and losing it. Japanese doctrine, meanwhile, remained rooted in concepts developed decades earlier. The Arisaka rifles were long-barreled, optimized for accuracy at distance. Japanese infantry training emphasized individual marksmanship, often conducted at ranges of 300 meters or more. Soldiers learned to estimate distance, adjust for wind, breathe properly, squeeze the trigger with patience. This produced excellent marksmen. But it also produced soldiers who, in the sudden violence of close combat, had to pause between shots, had to pull back the bolt, push it forward, re-aim, fire again. In theory, this was acceptable. Japanese tactical doctrine relied less on firefights and more on shock and maneuver. Night attacks. Infiltration. Close-quarters combat with bayonets. The rifle was not meant to win battles through volume of fire but to support disciplined advances and provide precision when needed. Machine guns, the Type 92 heavy machine gun, the Type 96 and Type 99 light machine guns, provided suppressive fire. Riflemen provided accuracy. This doctrine had worked in China. It had worked in the Philippines, in Malaya, in Burma. Japanese forces had swept across the Pacific with startling speed in late 1941 and early 1942, overwhelming Allied forces that were often demoralized, poorly supplied, or unprepared for the intensity of Japanese tactics. The Arisaka rifle had not failed them. Why would it fail now? What changed was the opponent. By mid-1942, American forces in the Pacific were no longer the surprised, under-equipped garrisons of Wake Island or Bataan. They were increasingly well-supplied, well-trained units who had learned painful lessons and adapted. And more importantly, they were armed with the M1 Garand in growing numbers. The island of Guadalcanal became the testing ground. In August 1942, U.S. Marines landed on the island to seize a Japanese airfield under construction. The battle that followed would last 6 months, a grinding, brutal campaign fought in jungles and across ridgelines, where both sides fed reinforcements into a meat grinder that neither could afford but neither could abandon. It was here, in the dense vegetation and sudden firefights, that the M1 Garand began to reveal its true value. Japanese intelligence reports from Guadalcanal started to shift in tone. Early assessments remained confident, even dismissive. But as weeks turned to months, a different picture emerged. American infantry were not breaking under banzai charges the way Filipino or British colonial troops sometimes had. They were standing their ground. And their fire, constant, overwhelming, relentless, was cutting down assault waves before they could close distance. One Japanese after-action report from late 1942, captured later in the campaign, noted with clinical precision, enemy rifle fire exceeds expected volume. Suppression of American positions requires more ammunition and time than anticipated. Casualties during daylight assaults are unacceptable. Another, more blunt, the enemy does not stop shooting. This was not supposed to happen. Japanese soldiers were trained to endure hardship, to accept death as part of duty. But enduring hardship did not mean ignoring tactical reality. Charging into concentrated fire was not bravery, it was suicide. And the fire coming from American positions was unlike anything Japanese infantry had faced before. The mockery faded. The word toys disappeared from reports. In its place came a different kind of respect, grudging, unwilling but undeniable. The Americans had built a rifle that turned ordinary soldiers into sources of sustained firepower. And in the close, brutal fighting of the Pacific Islands, that advantage was proving impossible to overcome. The stage was set. The weapon was in hand. And the battles ahead would demonstrate, again and again, what industrial capacity and tactical innovation could achieve when fused into 9.5 pounds of steel and walnut. Strip away the tactics, the training, the doctrine, and what remains is simple physics. The M1 Garand could fire 8 rounds as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. The Arisaka Type 38 or Type 99 could fire 1 round, then required the soldier to lift the bolt handle, pull it back against spring tension, push it forward to chamber a new cartridge, and push the handle down to lock the bolt. This took roughly 2 seconds for a trained soldier operating under ideal conditions. In combat, with adrenaline flooding the system and incoming fire cracking past, it took longer. The en-bloc clip system of the Garand was central to its effectiveness. Unlike traditional detachable magazines, the en-bloc clip held 8 rounds in a single unit that was inserted into the rifle from the top. The entire clip went into the internal magazine, and when the last round was fired, the clip automatically ejected, that famous metallic ping that became the weapon's signature sound. A trained soldier could reload in 3 to 5 seconds. The entire cycle, 8 rounds fired, clip ejected, new clip loaded, back in action, took less than 10 seconds. Compare this to the Arisaka. Japanese rifles used a 5-round stripper clip that had to be loaded into a fixed internal magazine. The soldier opened the bolt, placed the clip on top of the receiver, and used his thumb to push the cartridges down into the magazine. Then he removed the empty clip and closed the bolt. Reload time, 8 to 12 seconds, and that was just to get 5 rounds into the weapon. To fire those 5 rounds he had to cycle the bolt 4 times. The mathematics were brutal. In 1 minute, an American soldier with an M1 Garand could fire and reload multiple times, delivering 60 or more aimed shots. A Japanese soldier with an Arisaka could fire 15 to 20 rounds in the same period. The disparity meant that a single American rifleman had the effective firepower of 3 or 4 Japanese riflemen. Scale that across a platoon, and the imbalance became catastrophic. But raw fire rate was only part of the equation. The Garand's gas-operated system absorbed recoil efficiently, allowing the shooter to stay on target between shots. The rifle's weight, often criticized as excessive compared to lighter bolt actions, actually helped stabilize the weapon during rapid fire. And because the shooter never had to take his cheek off the stock or his eye from the sight picture, follow-up shots were faster and more accurate. Japanese officers recognized this. In captured documents and post-war interviews, they acknowledged that American infantry could maintain suppressive fire that pinned entire units in place. "We could not move," one veteran recalled. "Every time we tried to advance, the bullets came like rain. There was no gap in their fire. No pause. We would wait for them to reload, but the reloading never seemed to happen." This was the technological gap in its purest form, not a difference in quality of manufacture or design elegance, but a difference in combat outcomes. The M1 Garand allowed American soldiers to dominate the firefight, and in infantry combat, dominating the firefight is everything. Technology changes battles. Psychology changes soldiers. And for Japanese infantry encountering massed M1 Garand fire for the first time, the psychological impact was as devastating as the physical casualties. Japanese soldiers were not naive. They understood that combat was chaotic, deadly, and unpredictable. They had trained for it, mentally and physically, with a rigor that few other armies matched. But their training had conditioned them to expect certain rhythms of battle. Fire, take cover, advance during the enemy's reload. Identify enemy positions by the individual cracks of rifle fire. Close the distance. Use terrain. Overwhelm them with discipline and aggression. The M1 Garand broke that rhythm. When a Japanese unit advanced toward an American position, they expected to hear the scattered pops of rifle fire, individual soldiers shooting, cycling bolts, shooting again. There would be gaps. Moments when the fire slackened because the enemy had to reload. Those gaps were the windows for movement, for closing distance, for turning the firefight into a melee where Japanese soldiers, trained extensively in bayonet combat, had the advantage. Those gaps never came. Instead, the sound was continuous, overlapping. A sustained roar that seemed to have no beginning and no end. It was disorienting. One Japanese NCO, captured on Saipan in 1944, described it in his interrogation. "We thought we were facing machine guns. But they were everywhere. Every foxhole. Every position. How do you charge machine guns that are everywhere?" This confusion was critical. Japanese tactics relied on understanding the enemy's capabilities so they could be exploited. If you knew the enemy had machine guns, you maneuvered to avoid their fields of fire or concentrated artillery on their positions. But if the machine guns were not heavy weapons in fixed positions but individual riflemen scattered across the line, how did you counter that? The answer increasingly was that you didn't. Or you paid a terrible price trying. The psychological impact extended beyond confusion. It affected morale. Japanese soldiers were trained to believe in their spiritual superiority, their discipline, their willingness to sacrifice. These were real advantages in many contexts. But willingness to sacrifice meant little when you couldn't reach the enemy. And when assaults failed not because of cowardice or lack of effort but because the volume of incoming fire made success physically impossible, the narrative of superiority began to crack. American soldiers, conversely, experienced a different psychological shift. The M1 Garand gave them confidence. Not arrogance, combat in the Pacific was too brutal for that, but a sense that their weapon matched the task. Marines and soldiers who had trained with the Garand trusted it. They knew that if they encountered the enemy, they could put rounds downrange fast enough to respond, to suppress, to win the firefight. This confidence changed behavior. Soldiers with bolt-action rifles often adopted defensive mindsets. Find cover, conserve ammunition, make every shot count. Soldiers with the Garand could be more aggressive. Fire and maneuver became more intuitive. If you took fire, you could immediately return fire with volume that forced the enemy to keep their heads down while you moved to better position. One Marine corporal interviewed after Tarawa put it simply, "You didn't feel helpless. You felt like you could fight back." That feeling, small, subjective, impossible to quantify, was worth more than any technical specification. Weapons are tools. Battles are fought by people. And the M1 Garand succeeded not just because of its design but because of the men who carried it and the training that taught them how to use it. American soldiers in World War II underwent training that emphasized familiarity with their equipment. The M1 Garand was not an exotic weapon that only specialists could operate. It was issued to every rifleman, and every rifleman drilled with it until its operation became instinctive. Load the clip. Feel the bolt slam forward. Thumb away from the receiver to avoid M1 thumb, the painful injury caused when the bolt closed on an unwary digit. Shoulder the weapon. Acquire the target. Fire. The training was repetitive, relentless, and effective. By the time a soldier deployed to the Pacific, he had fired hundreds or thousands of rounds through the Garand. He knew its weight, its balance, its quirks. He knew the sound of the clip ejecting. He knew how to clear a jam, rare but possible. He knew that the rifle was reliable in rain, in mud, in sand as long as he maintained it. This familiarity bred competence, and competence bred confidence. Soldiers trusted their weapon because they understood it. It was not a mysterious machine but a known tool that responded predictably to their inputs. Japanese soldiers had a different relationship with their rifles. The Arisaka was treated with reverence. It was cleaned meticulously, maintained with near-religious care. But the training emphasis was less on volume of fire and more on precision. A Japanese soldier learned to shoot accurately at distance, to conserve ammunition, to make each round count. This produced skilled marksmen, but it also meant that when combat devolved into close-range chaos, as it so often did in the jungles and beaches of the Pacific, the rifle's limitations became the soldier's limitations. There was also a human cost to the Japanese emphasis on spiritual over material factors. Soldiers were taught that willpower and discipline could overcome material disadvantages. To some extent this was true. Japanese infantry achieved remarkable things through sheer determination. But no amount of willpower could make a bolt-action rifle fire faster. And when doctrine insisted that spirit mattered more than firepower, soldiers paid the price in blood for that insistence. American soldiers, by contrast, benefited from a culture that valued technical solutions to tactical problems. If a weapon gave an advantage, use it. If a tactic worked, refine it. There was less emphasis on mysticism and more on pragmatism. The M1 Garand fit perfectly into this mindset. It was a practical tool that made soldiers more effective. No one pretended it was sacred. It was just very, very good at its job. This difference in philosophy, spiritual discipline versus industrial pragmatism, played out in countless small moments across the Pacific. Japanese soldiers advancing with Arisakas, trusting in their training and their willingness to die, met American soldiers with Garands, trusting in their weapons' ability to put more bullets downrange faster. One side believed in the supremacy of the warrior spirit. The other believed in the supremacy of sustained fire. The jungle did not care about belief. It cared about who survived the firefight. And increasingly, survival favored the side with the M1 Garand. Leadership in combat is the art of making decisions with incomplete information under lethal pressure. For Japanese officers in the Pacific, the M1 Garand created a dilemma that no amount of training or doctrine had prepared them to solve. Traditional Japanese infantry tactics emphasized aggression and shock. The core maneuver was the assault, carefully planned, violently executed, often conducted at night to negate American advantages in firepower and air support. Japanese soldiers would infiltrate close to enemy positions, then launch coordinated charges designed to overwhelm defenses through sheer momentum and ferocity. Bayonets, grenades, close-quarters brutality. The goal was to get inside the enemy's decision-making cycle, to create chaos that disrupted command and control. These tactics had worked. In China, in Malaya, in the Philippines, Japanese forces had repeatedly shattered larger enemy formations through superior tactics and willingness to accept casualties. The doctrine was sound. The problem was that it assumed the enemy would break under pressure, that the psychological shock of a screaming charge in the darkness would cause defenders to panic, to flee, to collapse. American Marines with M1 Garands did not break. Japanese officers faced a cruel calculus. Daylight assaults were suicidal. The volume of fire from American positions made it nearly impossible to cross open ground. Even with artillery and mortar support, advancing units took devastating casualties before they could close to effective range. Night attacks offered better odds, but they came with their own challenges. Coordination was difficult in darkness, friendly fire incidents increased, and American forces quickly learned to use illumination rounds and interlocking fields of fire to disrupt Japanese formations. One Japanese officer, Lieutenant Fujita Yoshio, wrote in his diary on Guadalcanal in November 1942, "We are told to attack with spirit. But spirit does not stop bullets. We are told the enemy is weak. But the enemy's fire does not seem weak. Yesterday we lost 40 men trying to cross 200 meters of jungle. We did not reach their line." This was the officer's dilemma distilled to its essence. How do you lead men into situations where success requires them to cross ground swept by fire that no amount of courage can overcome? Japanese military culture demanded obedience. Orders were to be followed without question. But human beings, even highly disciplined ones, will eventually balk at orders that guarantee death without purpose. Some officers adapted. They shifted to infiltration tactics. Small units moving through jungle at night, bypassing American strong points, attacking supply lines and command posts. This was more effective but also more difficult to coordinate and required troops with specialized training. Other officers doubled down on traditional assaults, accepting horrific casualties in the belief that breakthroughs were possible if men simply tried hard enough. Neither approach solved the fundamental problem. American infantry with M1 Garands could generate more firepower per soldier than Japanese doctrine anticipated. The tactical models that Japanese officers had learned, based on experiences in China and projections about American fighting spirit, were no longer accurate. But adapting required admitting that the models were wrong, and institutional military cultures do not change quickly, especially in the middle of a war. The result was a grinding, bloody learning process in which Japanese units paid with lives for lessons that higher command often refused to incorporate. Officers at the front understood what they were facing. But officers at headquarters, removed from the immediate reality of combat, continued to insist that Japanese spirit and discipline would prevail. The disconnect between frontline experience and strategic planning grew wider with each failed assault. And the M1 Garand, in the hands of American soldiers who trusted it and used it well, continued to exact its toll. Behind every weapon is a philosophy of production, and the M1 Garand embodied a distinctly American approach to manufacturing, one that prioritized volume, interchangeability, and efficiency over artisanal craftsmanship. The Arisaka rifles carried by Japanese soldiers were well-made weapons. Each rifle was produced with care, often with parts hand-fitted by skilled workers. There was a pride in this, a sense that the weapon itself was a product of Japanese excellence, imbued with the care of those who made it. Rifles were marked with the imperial chrysanthemum, a symbol that connected the weapon to the emperor himself. To surrender one's rifle was not just a tactical failure but a spiritual disgrace. This approach to manufacturing reflected broader Japanese industrial practices in the 1930s and early 1940s. Japan had modernized rapidly, but its industrial base was smaller and less mechanized than that of the United States or Great Britain. Production relied more heavily on skilled labor and less on automated processes. Quality was high but output was limited. The M1 Garand came from a different world. American factories in the 1940s were the most advanced in the world, sprawling facilities with assembly lines, precision machinery, and standardized processes that allowed for mass production on a scale that seemed almost incomprehensible to observers from other nations. Springfield Armory and Winchester produced thousands of M1 Garands per month. Every part was interchangeable. A trigger assembly from one rifle could be swapped into another. A barrel manufactured in Massachusetts fit perfectly into a rifle assembled in Connecticut. This interchangeability was not accidental. It was the result of decades of refinement in American manufacturing practices, dating back to the 19th century when firearms makers like Samuel Colt had pioneered standardized production. By World War II, this philosophy had become second nature to American industry. Parts were made to precise tolerances. If something broke, you replaced the broken part, not the entire weapon. This had profound implications for logistics. American forces could stockpile spare parts and repair damaged rifles in the field. Japanese forces, with their less standardized production, often could not. A damaged Arisaka might require a skilled armorer to fabricate a replacement part or might simply be discarded. There was also a psychological dimension. American soldiers did not view their rifles as sacred objects. The M1 Garand was a tool, an excellent tool but still just equipment. If it broke, you fixed it or got a new one. This pragmatism extended to combat behavior. Soldiers were less likely to take foolish risks to recover a rifle because rifles were replaceable. Japanese soldiers, trained to view their weapons as extensions of honor, sometimes died trying to retrieve rifles that American soldiers would have simply abandoned. The industrial capacity that produced the M1 Garand also produced everything else America needed for war: ships, planes, tanks, ammunition in quantities that dwarfed Axis production. Japan's industrial output, even at its peak, was a fraction of America's. This disparity meant that even if Japanese weapons were individually superior, and in many cases they were not, the sheer weight of American production would eventually overwhelm them. The M1 Garand symbolized this. It was not a weapon born from tradition or craftsmanship. It was born from factories, from assembly lines, from an industrial system that could churn out hundreds of thousands of rifles and keep them supplied with millions of rounds of ammunition. It was the physical embodiment of American material superiority, not elegant, not romantic, but devastatingly effective. The introduction of the M1 Garand did not just give American soldiers a better rifle. It fundamentally changed how American infantry fought. Before the Garand, American rifle squads operated under a doctrine that concentrated automatic firepower in dedicated weapons. The Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, was the squad's primary source of sustained fire. The BAR gunner was the most important man in the squad, and tactics revolved around supporting him. Riflemen with bolt-action Springfields provided accurate fire and protected the BAR, but they were not expected to generate high volumes of fire themselves. The M1 Garand disrupted this model. Suddenly, every rifleman had semi-automatic capability. The squad's total firepower increased dramatically. This allowed for more flexible tactics. Squads could split into fire teams, with one element suppressing the enemy while the other maneuvered. The need to concentrate around the BAR decreased. Responsibilities could be distributed more evenly. American commanders recognized this and began adjusting training and tactical manuals. Fire and maneuver, the fundamental infantry tactic of pinning an enemy with fire while friendly forces moved to a better position, became easier to execute. With bolt-action rifles, achieving effective suppression required careful coordination and often the support of machine guns. With Garands, a few riflemen could generate enough fire to keep enemy heads down while their buddies moved. This was especially valuable in the Pacific, where the terrain, jungles, caves, bunkers, often broke up large unit formations into small, isolated engagements. A rifle squad might find itself cut off, facing enemy positions without immediate support from heavy weapons. In those situations, the Garand's firepower was the difference between surviving and being overrun. Japanese forces, meanwhile, struggled to adapt their tactics to counter this new reality. Their doctrine had been built around exploiting perceived weaknesses in American fighting spirit and firepower. But those weaknesses were rapidly disappearing. American soldiers were gaining experience, becoming harder, more confident. And their weapons were, quite simply, better for the kind of close-range high-intensity combat that characterized the Pacific Campaign. Some Japanese units tried to counter the Garand's firepower with increased use of machine guns and grenade launchers. Others relied more heavily on fortifications, bunkers and cave systems that could withstand rifle fire and force Americans to use flamethrowers and demolitions. These adaptations were partially successful, but they were also reactive, shaped by the need to respond to American advantages rather than imposing Japanese strengths. The tactical shift was not instantaneous. It took time for new doctrines to filter through training and into combat units. But by 1943, American infantry in the Pacific were operating with a level of confidence and aggressiveness that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. The M1 Garand was not the only reason for this. Experience, better supply lines, air superiority, and improved leadership all played roles, but it was a critical enabler. The rifle allowed tactics. The tactics allowed victories. And the victories, slowly and painfully, pushed Japanese forces back across the Pacific. Saipan. June 15, 1944. The island rises from the Pacific like a fortress. Cliffs on the western shore, beaches on the east, and in between 15 miles of jungle, sugarcane fields, and volcanic ridges. 32,000 Japanese soldiers garrison Saipan, under the command of Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito. They have been preparing for this moment for months. Bunkers carved into hills. Artillery pre-registered on every beach. Machine gun nests covering every approach. Saito has told his men that Saipan is the inner ring of the Emperor's defense. It must not fall. But on this morning, 71,000 U.S. Marines and Army soldiers are landing on the southern beaches. 8,000 men hit the shore in the first 20 minutes. Naval guns have pounded Japanese positions for days, but the defenses are deep, redundant, prepared. Japanese artillery opens up as the first landing craft grind onto the coral. Marines pour out into waist-deep water and push toward the beach through a storm of fire. They carry M1 Garands. The first hours are chaos. Marines establish a fragile foothold, a few hundred yards of beach, then a line of foxholes and shell craters just inland. Japanese counterattacks come in waves. Small unit actions. Infiltration attempts. Probing the American line for weak points. Each time the Marines respond with fire, continuous, overlapping, relentless fire. The sound echoes across the island like distant thunder that never fades. By nightfall, the Americans have pushed inland nearly a mile in some sectors. The line is uneven, ragged, but it holds. Japanese forces pull back to prepared positions in the ridges and wait. Orders come down from General Saito. Tomorrow night, a major counterattack. 3 battalions, supported by tanks, will drive the Americans back into the sea. It has worked before, on other islands in other battles. It will work again. The attack is scheduled for 3 a.m. June 17. Japanese forces assemble in darkness. Soldiers check their rifles one last time. Type 97 medium tanks, outdated by American standards but still dangerous, rumble into position. Officers synchronize watches. The plan is brutal in its simplicity: strike the center of the American line with overwhelming force, break through and roll up the flanks. Speed and aggression will carry the day. The Americans are tired from 2 days of combat. They are spread thin. Their supply lines are still disorganized. This is the moment. At 2:50 a.m. Japanese artillery opens up, a short, violent barrage meant to stun and disorient. Then silence. Then the charge. 4,000 men surge forward. Tanks lead the way, infantry following close behind. They move through darkness across open ground toward the American positions. 50 meters. 40. The plan is to close distance before the enemy can react, to get inside their defenses before they can organize resistance. But the Americans are not surprised. Patrols had detected the Japanese buildup. Machine gun crews are awake, waiting. Rifle squads are in position, fingers on triggers. And when the Japanese charge breaks into the open, the American line erupts. The sound is apocalyptic. Machine guns, rifles, mortars, all firing at once. Tracer rounds arc through the darkness like horizontal rain. The lead tanks are hit by anti-tank guns and brew up, flames silhouetting the infantry behind them. Japanese soldiers press forward, screaming, firing from the hip. Some reach the American foxholes. Hand-to-hand fighting erupts in isolated pockets. But the vast majority never make it. They are stopped by the M1 Garands. Individual Marines in foxholes fire as fast as they can pull the trigger. 8 rounds. Reload. More. The clips eject with metallic pings that are swallowed by the roar of battle. No pause. No hesitation. No gap in the fire that Japanese soldiers can exploit. Every time a wave of attackers surges forward, they run into a wall of lead that cuts them down. One Marine corporal, interviewed later, described it: "You just kept shooting. You didn't think. You didn't count. You just saw shapes moving and you fired. The Garand just kept going. I went through maybe 20 clips in 10 minutes. I don't know how many I hit. I don't know how many somebody else hit. We were all just firing into the same space." The Japanese attack falters. Then stalls. Officers shout orders, trying to rally their men, but the fire does not slacken. Some units pull back. Others press forward and are annihilated. By 4:30 a.m. the counterattack has failed. Japanese bodies lie in heaps across the open ground. American casualties are significant, but the line holds. General Saito receives the reports at dawn. 3 battalions shattered. Tanks destroyed. The Americans are still there and they are digging in deeper. He orders his remaining forces to fall back to the island's interior, to the mountains and caves where the terrain might offset American firepower. But there is no offsetting it. Not anymore. The battle for Saipan drags on for 3 more weeks, but the decisive moment has passed. Japanese forces are trapped on an island with nowhere to retreat. American Marines and Army soldiers push inland, methodically clearing bunkers, caves, ridgelines. Each position is a small war unto itself. Japanese soldiers fight with ferocious determination, inflicting casualties, making the Americans pay for every yard. But they are losing. And in almost every engagement, the M1 Garand is part of the reason why. On June 22, a rifle platoon from the 27th Infantry Division encounters a fortified Japanese position overlooking a critical road junction. The position is built into a hillside, a network of bunkers connected by trenches, with interlocking fields of fire covering the approach. Machine guns and riflemen have clear lines of sight across 200 meters of open ground. The Americans need that road. They need it today. The platoon leader, a lieutenant named Robert Haynes, studies the position through binoculars. He can see muzzle flashes from at least 3 machine guns. Rifle fire is coming from a dozen positions. Frontal assault would be suicide. But they do not have time to wait for artillery or air support. The division is pushing north, and this position is blocking their advance. Haynes makes a decision. He splits his platoon. 1 squad will provide suppressive fire from their current position. The other 2 squads will flank left and right, using a shallow ravine for concealment, and try to get close enough to use grenades and flamethrowers. The suppressing squad opens up. 30 men with M1 Garands, firing in controlled bursts at the Japanese bunkers. The volume of fire is staggering. They are not trying to hit specific targets, the bunkers are too well protected for that, but to force the Japanese to keep their heads down, to disrupt their ability to track the flanking squads. The Garands fire continuously. Every few seconds a clip pings out and a soldier reloads. The rhythm is relentless. The Japanese machine gunners try to return fire but struggle to acquire targets. Every time they expose themselves to shoot, rifle rounds crack past them or slam into the sandbags protecting their position. They fire blind, spraying bullets at muzzle flashes. It is not enough. The flanking squads reach grenade range. Explosions ripple across the bunker line. American soldiers rush forward with flamethrowers and satchel charges. Close quarters fighting erupts. 15 minutes later, the position is overrun. Japanese casualties, 43 dead. American casualties, 8 wounded, none killed. Lieutenant Haynes writes in his after-action report, "Enemy position was neutralized through coordinated fire and maneuver. The volume of rifle fire from the suppressing squad was critical in preventing effective enemy response." It is a clinical description of a small engagement that will not make any history books. But it is repeated hundreds of times across Saipan. Small units using the M1 Garand's firepower to suppress, maneuver, and overwhelm Japanese positions that, in an earlier era, would have required heavy weapons and significant casualties to reduce. By early July, Japanese resistance on Saipan is collapsing. General Saito orders a final banzai charge, a mass assault by the remaining Japanese forces, including wounded soldiers and civilians pressed into service. It is not a tactical maneuver. It is a death ritual. On the night of July 7th, approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians charge American positions on the northern end of the island. The charge is suicidal. American machine guns and artillery tear into the attacking mass. But the sheer numbers mean that some attackers reach American foxholes. Hand-to-hand combat erupts across a 2-mile front. In the darkness and chaos, the M1 Garand proves its worth once again. Soldiers fire point-blank into the attacking horde. No time to aim. No time to think. Just fire, reload until the charge breaks. By dawn, the ground is carpeted with bodies. Japanese casualties exceed 3,000. American casualties are heavy, over 600 killed and wounded, but the line holds. The banzai charge, the ultimate expression of Japanese fighting spirit, has failed. Not because American soldiers were braver. Not because they had more spirit. But because they had more firepower, and firepower in the end was what mattered. Saipan is declared secure on July 9, 1944. The cost has been horrific. Over 3,000 Americans killed. Over 13,000 wounded. Japanese casualties, 24,000 soldiers dead, plus thousands of civilians who died in the fighting or committed suicide in the final days.